Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first of our November lecture series this year. And my name is Chuck Smythe. I'm the Director of the History and Culture Department at Sealaska Heritage Institute. I would like to thank Sealaska Corporation for providing us this facility for today's lecture, and to welcome you to the talk entitled Kooteeyaa, the Travails and Travails of a Tlingit Totem Pole from Tuxican, Prince of Wales Island in southeast Alaska, by Professor Steve Langdon. He's Professor Emeritus, Department of Anthropology, University of Alaska. He taught at UAA for 36 years and was known as a distinguished teacher and student advisor, and developed courses in the comparative formation of civilizations around the world that became a required unit for undergraduates. In 2012, he was recognized by the University of Alaska Foundation with the prestigious Edith R. Bullock Prize for Excellence. His primary scholarly focus has been on Southeast Alaska, where he has researched and analyzed systems of pre-contact, historic, and contemporary fisheries of the Tlingit and Haida peoples. Of substantial importance in this regard is his research on prehistoric fish trap technologies in the Prince of Wales archipelago, his scholarship of Tlingit and Haida salmon fishing and traditional ecological knowledge in Southeast Alaska, and his research on subsistence practices of Alaska Natives in various areas of the state. He has a well-developed comprehension of issues relating to equity and fishery management regimes, and is known for his early work on permit transfer patterns in limited entry fisheries, and has served on 2 National Academy of Science review boards, most recently examining the Community Development Quota, or CDQ, program, which allows for community ownership of fisheries quota, established for the Bering Sea coastal villagers, and has conducted research on the implementation and impacts of this program on small villages in the Gulf of Alaska and other areas. He is also known for his research on a variety of topics relating to ethnohistoric and contemporary social and cultural dimensions of Alaska Native life. And we're going to hear about one of those today. So I'd like to welcome Steve, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Chuck. I appreciate it. I'm very pleased to be here again in Juneau and visiting with friends and seeing people that I know, and like to thank Sealaska Heritage Institute for the invitation and for the honor of being able to participate in the Native American Month series of lectures. I also want to recognize the clans of the Takjik'aan, upon whose lands we are conducting our affairs today, and thank them for their ownership and their trusteeship of those lands. Now, today's talk is part of an ongoing set of research and practical activities that I'm engaged in related to this particular Kooteeyaa or pole. And as a little bit of a preamble with regard to the remarks I'm going to give today, I'd like to indicate that this is one example of carved wooden obelisks of Tlingit monumental art, which were erected in villages of Tlingit and Haida in southeastern Alaska. They are often referred to as totem poles in English. An important dimension of tonight's talk needs to be identified, and that is the context for a respectful discussion. Kooteeyaa is at its base in Tlingit traditional spiritual thought a being with like all of us, with a spiritual entity, and that in part reflects the efforts of the people who created it, as well as those who thought about its creation. These particular forms of Kooteeyaa, the memorial and mortuary forms, are of enormous significance in Tlingit culture, due to their spirituality inherent, as I just mentioned, but also due to their significant role they play in connecting clan members across the generations of existence. Human remains have been a part of the spiritual association with Kooteeyaa in some cases. If bones of the person who the pole is erected in honor of, following cremation, have been placed in a box, and they may have been placed in such poles, then they follow a particular and more significant role. At the present time, there's no conclusive evidence that this particular Kooteeyaa was a memorial pole housing box skeletal remains, but it is at the time of its removal. But if so, that act of desecration associated with the removal of the pole and whatever became of the bones associated with it is a deeply troubling and unfortunate dimension of this particular episode. So it is important to respectfully recognize this violation, potential violation, at the outset of the presentation. The remarks that follow have been built upon the works of many, some of which I will talk about. I first encountered evidence with regard to the displaced Kooteeyaa while browsing through a collection of photographs housed at the Takjik'aan Museum in the mid-1990s. It was as yet unidentified person who noted on the picture of this photo that the pole had in fact come from the village of Tuxican. The photo that I'm referencing, that I looked at, was on the estate of the actor Vincent Price, all of our favorite horror actor from the 1950s and 60s, in Hollywood. And in full glory, the pole was erected and surrounded by cactus. This put into my mind a rather interesting set of thoughts, amongst them, how did it happen that this particular pole arrived on the estate of Vincent Price, and how might I learn some more about that. I subsequently took the picture back to my colleague whom I've worked with for many years in Klawock, John Rowan, and we pulled out our old pictures of Tuxican that date back to before the turn of the century, and sure enough, we were able to locate the position of this pole in the village of Takjik'aan at a time in the 19th century. And subsequently, of course, then the questions of what its travels from that point of time after having been erected is important. Now, in around about 2004, Wayne Howell, who's a cultural affairs officer with Glacier Bay National Park, inquired to me about the pole, and he sent me some materials that linked the pole ultimately back to the actor John Barrymore. So beyond Vincent Price, as you'll see, there's another phase. It was Howell who told me he thought it was being stored in the Honolulu Museum, although the exact whereabouts were unknown. In 2013, I was scheduled to attend a conference in Honolulu, and the presence of the pole as possibly being found there again entered my mind, and I contacted the Klawock tribe, and I asked if they were interested in having me try to find and see if the pole was located there. They indicated that they were, and they wrote a letter of representation for me, which I then forwarded to the director of the museum and asked that, as the representative of the tribe, would it be possible for me to come to the museum and discuss with officials and see if they in fact had such a pole. Well, surprisingly, I got back an immediate response which said, yes, we have the pole, and you're more than welcome to come to meet with us, and we will show you where the pole is at. And so in April of 2013, I came to the museum, and I brought with me all of the many of the photos that you'll see later on showing the position of the pole in place, and one very important photo as well indicating its displacement. And I'll tell more of that story later on. And subsequently, I've been consulting with a number of Tlingit artists and carvers about aspects of the pole, and we'll share some of that as well. So over the past 120 years or so, a remarkable set of circumstances and events have transpired around this initially substantial piece of red cedar with its own spiritual presence that began its existence in the forest of northwest Prince of Wales Island. From that particular location, it was respectfully approached by the people of Tuxican, and then taken and carved into its subsequent form as this particular Kooteeyaa. It has undergone an extraordinary odyssey of travels and travails that will be shown, and is found at present in the basement of a museum in Honolulu, Hawaii. Its primary reason for this odyssey arises from the initial determination of the Tlingit clan and the carvers to transform the tree and its spirit into Kooteeyaa, a wooden carved being depicting the clan crests of the deceased party in whose memory it was made. It was erected just above high tide in the village of Takjik'aan, right in the central part of its context. While the notoriety of Kooteeyaa has been enormously expanded due to its theft by John Barrymore in 1931, the entire odyssey, hopefully not yet complete, with it is quite a remarkable story with the intersection of cultural meanings and motivations along the way across cultural boundaries. I'm going to make an assumption that most of the viewers are relatively familiar with the nature of Tlingit culture, its basic construct. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into some of it. This map indicates the general regional circumstances of Tlingit and Haida position in southeastern Alaska, and it also shows you in large scale where the village was from which this pole was taken. Tuxican is located on the west coast of Prince of Wales Island and was the major village of the combined Kwans at the time of European occupation or European presence coming into the region, and it subsequently it was deoccupied around between 1905 and 1910. The location of the village, I think, it was in many respects a fortress village. It's a fortress. I refer to certain Tlingit villages as fortress villages, not from the fact that they were necessarily palisaded or protected, but because of their geographic location, they were protected from the onslaught of the U.S. Navy. Most Tlingit villages were exposed, but Tuxican quickly became consolidated, and it basically did not appear on the charts of the Russians, and it did not appear on the charts of the in the U.S. Naval records until the late 1880s. As such, it could not be approached. The other village that achieves that status, basically, is the village of Klawock. They both have that particular element going for them in terms of their proximity. So in addition, we need to understand within any Kwan there is a structure of clans, and we'll talk a little bit more about the clans later on. But later on top of the Kooteeyaa Kwan and Klawock Kwan, they were originally two separate Kwans that have been merged over time. One housed in the lower sections here. Clans 1, 2, and 3 were Klawock Kwan, and the other ones to the north were Kooteeyaa Kwan. And so these are the reconstructed territories of those clans approximately 1860, prior to the coming of the smallpox epidemic, which devastated this particular part of Alaska, as well as other Tlingit communities as well, and westward too. So there are some significant cultural concepts and practices that have to be borne in mind. The Kwan, of course, references the spatial organization of villages and clans. Tlinkits trace descent matrilineally. The society divides itself into matrilineal halves, the moiety structures. Inside the moieties are the clans, which are in turn subdivided into the house. The houses are named and ranked within a community, and associated with each house and clan are atu, the sacred clan property that are held as part of the heritage and the demonstration of the clan's past, as well as its claims and ownership. Shagun is the representation that all of the Tlingit people from the past and the present are part of the clan's collective. The personal name is extremely significant because the return of the deceased ancestor occurs in the spirit of the name. This form of reincarnation is the way in which the cycling of existence occurs in Tlingit society. And in order for that to be accomplished in the traditional spiritual realm, bodies had to be cremated. And the soft tissues were cremated, the hard portions retained, and they were thereafter placed in boxes and positioned. The only exception was the shaman. The kuwait, the subsequent memorial potlatch, which was a very significant event in terms of not only honoring the deceased, but ensuring that the spiritual form could return and be reincarnated. And finally, the Kooteeyaa, which is the carved wooden pole, and it's one type of monumental art erected in remembrance of a person or an occasion. So there are various different types of Kooteeyaa, and their locations vary depending on the type and the context that we have. There are house poles or posts. These are internal posts. They hold up the rafters for the roofs in the traditional houses, and they may or may not be carved and painted with crests or atu of the clan. Now, these were first identified. The first Euro-American identification of these occurred in 1779. Spanish explorers went ashore just south of Klawock into a fort village and went inside and found these carved and painted entities. So they clearly predate the coming of Euro-Americans as important objects. The mortuary or memorial poles are the external freestanding poles, and they're usually beside or behind a house. Often they have only a plain bottom with a single crest of the moiety or clan of the individual at the top. And they may be designed to hold in a box the bones of a deceased following cremation of the person or persons that might be memorialized by the pole. In certain places there were entrance poles that you would enter into a house through an elliptical opening. There are external honorific posts as well, which were erected on occasions of honoring an individual or a specific event. These kinds of forms are mostly post-contact, and they may present the clan atu. There are also shame poles. These are external freestanding poles to announce unpaid or unresolved wrong, and the pole implicates and announces to the world who the other party in the dispute is. And finally, there are also watchman poles. These are mostly found in the southern part of Tlingit territory. And these are solitary freestanding poles that occur away from villages. All of these other constructs are found in the neighborhood of villages, but these can occur on points of significance, usually related to other aspects, and may be in association with shaman burials. So the Kooteeyaa in Northwest Coast art, Indian representation, and Western art are a particular kind of monumental form that is found elsewhere in the Northwest Coast. And they are certainly a very, very spectacular part of the traditional Tlingit landscape. As I mentioned, the Spanish explorers first encountered them in Bucareli Bay in 1779. Later on, you'll see here momentarily in the Spanish artists sketched two forms of monumental Tlingit art at Yakutat Bay in 1791. As you will see as well in these images, the early Spanish, Malaspina, and British Cook artists were unable to accurately reproduce the images. And in the Western thought, they were regarded as grotesque and ugly. And that particular characterization continues down well into the 20th century as the way in which Western art interpreted these phenomena. Appreciation for the art grew in the mid-20th century, but it was not until the formal analysis of the anthropologist Bill Holm and the popularity of Haida artist Bill Reed that true appreciation amongst the broader public and the artistic community began to emerge. The French anthropologist, well-known and famous, Claude Lévi-Strauss, considered Northwest Coast Indian art style to be one of the world's unique traditions of representation of equivalence to the Egyptian and Greek artistic traditions. These are the two Spanish representations of Tlingit monuments at Yakutat in 1791. And you can see, particularly on the left, graphic representation of my assertion about how the Western artist's eye was simply not able to grapple with this new form and construct that they were confronted with. Both of these are also interesting in regard to today's discussion. Both of these images. Does anybody can tell me how they relate to what we're talking about today? These two representations, the forms. What are they of? What is this?
Memorial pole.
Exactly. And what's this over here? That's exactly right. So the presentation of the cremated bones in boxes goes back to these very first representations. These are freestanding poles that have and house the remains. And according to this one, the heading here, it says, this is the tomb of the previous Ancao, or leader, of Mulgrave Sound, which is what the Spanish called Yakutat. And the artist is Jose Cardero of that. But it's quite interesting in terms of this kind of representation, but at least they did find out that that's what it did represent. So going forward now into the village of Takjik'aan, and this is the oldest image that I located serendipitously in archives about 30 years ago from the 1880s. And as you can see, people are still living there. The smoke is coming out of the smoke hole in the primary house. And notice all of what's along the beach. Everywhere except this one is a canoe. So we have in place a very traditional community, but we also find some initial transformations of these houses in the use of this particular kind of door structure. Who knows the name of that kind of door structure that we pass through all the time? Anybody know its architectural term? It's called a pillar and lintel type of doorway as opposed to the elliptical one. So they've already transformed it, and we can see here, this represents probably the house of a major leader, the beginnings also, and the appropriation and the use of what do these stand for in there. And we can see them in this house as well. The incorporation of windows has already come into the circumstance of this village. But very, very early on, and you'll see later on, this is where Kooteeyaa stands, right there, in the center at the very heart of the village. And there it is, represented probably shortly after in the 1890s, again prominently displayed surrounding it. There are more poles now than in the previous one, and those poles are probably associated with some deaths, but we can see its preeminence in terms of its positioning, and also the fact that still the primary mode of travel and transportation in the community is the canoe. So then moving forward in time, this is Tajik'aan in approximately 1900, and around 1903, Governor Brady came to calling to Prince of Wales Island to the villages and asked leaders if they would donate, and I put that word, donate. That's always the poles from the communities to go to the Alaska Exposition in St. Louis in 1904. And at that particular time, several of the poles from Tajik'aan were taken, also one from Klawock. The one from Klawock is actually a replica of it is found in the Anchorage Museum. If any of you have ever been there and seen the pole there, that comes from Klawock, and a number of other poles from Haida communities were taken as well. So it's still in place, as the village transforms. This image is, we begin to see that the community is probably undergoing change, the growing foliage as a result of the population being consolidated at Klawock. But Kooteeyaa is still proudly in place in its location. James Simard of the Alaska Historical Library suggests this is about 1908, based upon the photographic history of William Case down there. Now, this is around 1910, and the pole landscape has gradually really disappeared, and I've always wondered in terms of where the poles gone, because they were not taken by Tlingit people. Have they all fallen down? But Kooteeyaa is still present right here. The house that you saw before so beautifully with the smoke coming out is obviously in disrepair as the population has begun to relocate. Now here we find images taken in 1921 of the bottom portion of the pole, very good in identifying the characteristics that we'll talk about a little later on, the clan crests, and they were provided by the Denver Museum, and this is their picture of the full Kooteeyaa, still quite holding up extremely well. But now we can see other poles that have reappeared somehow in the back of it. So there are some puzzles associated with the sequence of these images that I haven't fully worked out in my mind in terms of the sequencing of these. So comprehending Kooteeyaa over this time period, a number of questions have to be addressed to understand and comprehend Kooteeyaa and place it in various contexts. What does it represent? What clan crests are evident? This would place it in the context of Tlingit clan society and tell us about who erected it and who therefore did the carving from the opposite side. Was it a burial pole? Why did John Barrymore acquire it? Did he steal it? Why did Vincent Price acquire it? And evidence can be offered in answer to most of these questions, but definitive interpretations are not easily arrived at a number of them. So if we look inside the Takjik'aan at the clan structure, there's the classic division into the raven and the eagle, wolf eagle as it is called in the south, very prominent in this particular area of Takjik'aan are both the Takjik'aan AD are in the close vicinity, Tlin AD, Kakoshitan are right to the north, Shunkwe D right to the south. And the Ganachari also are all clans that were represented in the map of the clan territories before. So we need to place the pole then in the context of the crests associated with these different clans. So what are Kooteeya's crests? This is one of those things that's not absolutely cut and dried, as is often the case. So here we have at the top image is one that has various different kinds of interpretations, as with the various artists that I've consulted on it. Well, critical to mention of it is that the curved beak comes all the way back down to the mouth. And as such, that represents, in at least one consultant's mind, a clear evidence that it is a thunderbird. But it has also been positioned as a hawk or a golden eagle. And that particular designation, all three of those stand on the wolf-eagle side. So this, as the paramount crest, would give us the sense of where it was. The second image is of a man's face and with his hands, and he's holding the tail of the sea creature below. And this is a characteristic demonstration in Kooteeyaa art as well with regard to the personal representation of the crest image held by that particular clan. And the third image is another one that posed is of interest. What is this particular sea creature? It has been considered it's either a small or female killer whale, or it might be a pilot whale, and some in early thoughts was that it's a shark, but it is not a shark by any means, but I'll have something little bit to say more about that. All of those crests all again fall on the wolf-eagle side of the Tlingit moiety divide. And the final bottom image is of a bear or wolf. Now we'll come back and discuss that a little bit more. So it's basically we can assign this initially to absolutely to the wolf-eagle side, and how do these crests then line up with the local clan? Consultants are generally of the opinion that this was in honor of or representations of the Shunkwedi or Shungukedi clan, as it's known in the north, of the Eagle Wolf moiety. This clan had 4 houses at Tajik'aan, and it was the primary Eagle Wolf clan amongst the Takjik'aan. So it would not come as a surprise that that's the pole that, that's being represented. So let's move on to some of the other questions. This is an actor not only on the stage and screen, but in our little episode today. John Barrymore is a very halcyon figure in Hollywood. And he lived between 1882 and 1942, and he was considered the preeminent actor of his generation. He achieved great glory as a theatrical Shakespearean, and moved on to movies, first in silent and then into sound movies. He comes from a multi-family lineage of 3 generations of an acting dynasty. John is at the lower right. Drew Barrymore, famous for a variety of reasons, including the making of a film in North Alaska recently, is John Barrymore's grandchild. And according to Greg Mank, she identifies most with her grandfather, John, in terms of her own lineage. Now, Barrymore played a number of significant roles that he was known for. He played Hamlet, that was his chief Shakespearean role. He loved to play the role of Jekyll and Hyde. Those are his own sketches representing himself. And in this very, very prominent film of the late 1920s, early 1930s, called Grand Hotel. Who amongst the film buffs who can tell us who's the lady sitting there with John Barrymore? Anybody? Huh?
Garbo.
That's right, Greta Garbo. That's Greta Garbo sitting there. And she said that the kiss with John Barrymore, the first of her movie career, wasn't too bad in this film. John Barrymore's home that he moved to at the height of his success was called Bella Vista. And this was the site of many events, both stately parties, but also drunken bacchanals. He's been considered a part of the Hellfire Gang, in the words of Greg Mank, him and his buddies. And who knows who the gentleman on the right of Mr. Barrymore is in this particular photograph? Do you know who it is?
Errol Flynn.
She knows, of course. That's Errol Flynn up there as well. So Errol Flynn and Vincent Price came to these parties and were a part of this circle of individuals. John Barrymore, about this time, about in late 1930, when he was very flush with money, he previously had another yacht. He acquired this 120-foot young lot, cruised at 12 knots, on which he was able to move from the Galapagos Islands to Alaska with incredible amounts of pictures. He cruised southeast Alaska waters on several occasions, and I just might add as a quick footnote, he's not necessarily the first, but he's first, but this is a continuing interesting presence of Hollywood male actors, typically in sort of quasi-macho modes, coming to Alaska. He's followed in that sequence by James Arness. James Arness played Matt Dillon. Frank C. out in Huna used to take him hunting. He was followed by John Wayne, who came up here in his yacht. You can see all of the macho tones of these folks coming up. And in the town of Klawock, the last of this halcyon sequence of macho figures, Clint Eastwood showed up in his yachts on a regular basis, and there were sketches in this little diner of Clint Eastwood coming into Klawock. Now, it's turned into a more delicate presence, as I understand from people talking about. We no longer have the outdoors macho aspect of it associated with it, but the new ones, like for example, Brad Pitt has come into Cake and purchased art from the artist Michael Jackson down there. And as I understand it, but I haven't got confirmed evidence, Johnny Depp has been in Huna looking at possibilities. So it's a different tenor now by which people come to appreciate or enjoy Southeast Alaska. He traveled on Infanta. This is actually a picture somewhere in southeastern Alaska. Almost looks like Ward Cove to me. In 1931, when he acquired Kooteeyaa. And this is part of Barrymore's macho motif. According to his biographer, Barrymore traveled to Alaska in 3 different years. In 31, he came in May and in August. And August is likely the time he took this brown bear somewhere in the icy straits vicinity. This means that he likely obtained Kooteeyaa in May in order to return it to California and come back for his subsequent episodes. Kooteeyaa, by the way, stood 29 feet from the surface. It was sawed off at ground level, which means what? What does it mean? At Tajik'aan there is what? That's right. The stump of the pole is still there at the village. This is the ultimate photo, which demonstrates Barrymore's crew preparing to take Kooteeyaa using ropes from the yacht. At least 4 and possibly 5 men appear in the image. 4 of them are wearing the characteristic caps worn by maritime crewmen of the period. And you can see how it's being positioned and getting ready. The house is almost completely gone by now. Oh my God, boy, that didn't come out well. I wonder what happened there. This is the picture. I could pass around the picture or stand up in terms of its image. This is the classic image of Barrymore standing in front of the Kooteeyaa on his estate. Picture probably somewhere in the mid-1930s or a little bit earlier. Now, Barrymore and Kooteeyaa, ominous conjectures. According to his friend and biographer Fowler, an American settler on Lemishire Island, which we'll have more to say in a minute, where Jack acquired a totem pole. This particular phrase, where Jack acquired a totem pole, is a misunderstanding, and it led Wayne Howell to look into the possibility that the pole came from the Icy Straits area, told Barrymore that to remove such a tribal emblem from its appointed place meant bad luck. During the voyage home, Jack became concerned about what the settler had told him. Barrymore said that he halfway believed that the tribal gods, in whose behalf the pole had been erected, noticed the construction in Barrymore's mind of what was being represented, might take a notion into their whimsical noggins to wreak vengeance on the thief. So this is in his biographer's representation of the, and in fact some of that language, as you can see, is actually quoted by Fowler from Barrymore. So based upon what he heard, this gives a particular representation that perhaps he wasn't quite clear on what he had taken, but that's differently understood. Now this is a sketch map made by Wayne Howell in terms of what he was looking at. He thought, based upon conversations with Sam Hanlon, Wushkitan from Huna, who indicated that there was a shark pole taken from the vicinity of the Shark House located right here at Point Gustavus originally. And so that's what led Wayne to investigate whether in fact this pole might have been the one, because that text says that he acquired the pole in Icy Strait. And this is the location where of the Ibox house where John Barrymore had this conversation with the American settler. And these are the Ibox, Joe and Muzz Ibok, who occupied that island, and they were the friends with Barrymore. He visited them on a number of occasions, and he commented that the couple were the only real people he ever met, and the only ones who made him feel like a regular guy. Obviously, they play an interesting role in giving him a different sense of what he was about in the taking of that pole. Now, this is a recent book put together as primary officer Greg Mank, called, and in this cartoonist feature, you can see all of the group of the partiers that was a part of John Barrymore's past. And he says, after sailing and venture to Alaska in 1931, Barrymore brought home a new acquisition, a towering totem pole, and he erected it to loom. Notice the verb loom over Bella Vista. It's painted grotesque faces. This is a continuing representational stream in general American public for anyone visiting the number 6 Tower Road estate. Now, Barrymore had two very famous siblings, Lionel and Ethel, who were also very much significant in the movie realm. Lionel, his brother, was concerned. John had learned, well, Lionel says, bodies of Alaskan natives entombed in the totem pole, and Lionel Barrymore feared the curse that it threatened to cast down upon the unbowed head of his brother. Years later, he, meaning Lionel, still blamed his brother's spectacular downfall on the totem pole. Barrymore's fate. At the end of his life, Barrymore's excesses, his alimony, and his loss of memory contributed to a downfall from the heights of a decade previous. He died in 1942, dissolute and penniless, despite selling off much of his estate in his acquisition. Was the curse real? Certainly his son, John Barrymore II, had significant problems in his life. Here is a self-portrait as King Lear, raging against the end of life. How then did this come to be and part of Vincent Price? At the estate sale, following Barrymore's death, Mary Price, Vincent's wife, came in and knew that Vincent was interested in the pole and decided to buy it. Vincent Price himself obtained a degree in fine arts and developed an interest in primitive art. He went on to a career as the best-known horror actor of his generation in movies and TV. He was acquainted with Barrymore and certainly with the pole as a result of that particular acquaintance. This is the image that initially caught my eye in 1994, and that is, as you can see, Vincent Price standing by Kooteeyaa and associated with cactus in the back of his estate. This Kooteeyaa has been modified in one significant respect that you'll see later on from its previous forms and when we look at its last images. So here are Vincent Price's sentiments about Kooteeyaa that he conveyed. In his autobiography, he offered his own interpretation of the pole. Its lovely warm browns and reds still glowing. They're still glowing, but they're post-contact paints on the pole, on the three great figures which compose its height. At the bottom, a great bear-like creature, paws pleading, and on his head, a pale, lean man who holds before him a gigantic fish which reaches from his shoulders to his toes, and on his head, the hawk-nosed and savage, crouches a great bird, his tail behind him with red feathers made of shingling. Being a burial pole, okay, so once again the idea that there's knowledge that it's a burial pole is coming forward. It was sculpted in the round so that the three creatures retain their separate identity as completely as realized forms. And he considered the Kooteeyaa sculptural and dignified and beautiful, unlike other poles he had seen. Vincent Price did come to Alaska on several occasions, but nothing in his evidence indicates he ever approached the Tlingit or talked about the pole. He gave other acquisitions were on his mind. So was it the macabre quality of the pole linked to that dimension of Price's existence, or the artistic that motivated Price to its acquisition? Perhaps it was both. But there's another dimension too, and that's the dimension of extravagance and the display that is part of it. So here are these aspects. Some night or some dewy dawn, come over to our house. We'll give you a cup of coffee, and after we've worn you to a frazzle with the whys and wherefores of what we like, we'll let you out by the side door. We don't have to point it out to you. It's hard to miss a totem pole. 25 feet tall, but there it stands in our backyard for all the world to see. A totem in our backyard, Mr. Price, of course. Doesn't everybody have one? And then, while I was telling this story to my brother-in-law and my sister, brother-in-law ran through his mind. He said, "Why have this cookbook by the Prices?" And I think that pole is in that cookbook. So here's the cookbook, a treasury of great recipes. In addition to their art collecting, the bon vivants, the Prices as bon vivants, were gourmands and purveyors of stylish living to their friends. And inside here, what do we have? Kooteeyaa once again on display for luncheon atmosphere for the Prices. We lunch in our garden. Mary has some favorite props. A wondrous scalloped shell heaped with cracked crab, bronze Art Nouveau head filled with sourdough rolls, and a towering totem pole from Barrymore's hillside, all glorious aids to happy eating. So you find the way in which the pole is positioned again in a grand living domain. Okay, Mary Price was a patron of the arts, and she supported many museums, and she and Vincent collected an enormous and very substantial and impressive collection of indigenous American art. After the divorce from Vincent in the early 1980s, she deeded and transferred Kooteeyaa to the Honolulu Academy and later Museum of Art. Kooteeyaa arrived in Honolulu in 1981 and has resided in the basement for the past 30 years. This is the expert reverse and valuation by Harmar Jones, a well-known Native American art evaluator, and he submitted this at the time of its acquisition. And this was in 1981, as you can see, when they called upon him to do this. That's any time a museum acquires an object, they have to do this kind of verification and figuring out. And you can see Harmar clearly knew that it was from Tuxican, okay? And it should have been reported back to the village. When NAGPRA came into effect, it never was. Notice the valuation at that time. Crank 1981's $90,000 into contemporary figures and figure out what its potential value in the museum world might be. And this then was his discussion of the characteristics of it, and he noted that the piece arrived in 3 parts. So the desecration continued beyond merely the taking of it, but in fact the figures were decapitated. This for the ease in transportation. And indeed, there is an inner support system which consisted of a steel piece up the back to consolidate it. The entire piece was cleaned, revealing more of the original polychroming than was thought to be present. So this is how then it was received at the museum. There you can see this is the only time that any portion of it was ever put on display. And here you can see my reference to the decapitation that went on in terms of the pole. And this, of course, is the top portion of the figure, and it was on display for, according to the curator, for maybe a year or two. They stipulated that they had no way to bring it out and put it together and put it on display for any kind of continuous use. So in April of 2013, the old gentleman on the right in the picture showed up and talked to Jay Jessen and to Jane, whose last name escapes me, and they took me down to the bottom of the museum's basement, and they took me back to where Kooteeyaa was being housed. And here you can see the 3 sections that it exists in. And one of the, this is the major transformation, is right here. That particular piece in the original was much smaller and lower. And this is partly what directed Wayne Howell to begin to think of it as a shark, But if he thought more about what sharks look like and looked into it, the tail would have quickly made it clear that that's what it wasn't there. Now, Kooteeya's travails include being cemented together, being bolted together, and having an iron shaft shoved up his back, so to speak, in order for him to continue on. Those are the colors that persist today. That's pretty substantial coloration. As like I said, those are post-contact paints that appear on it. Here is the embedding of it's quite easily seen that this is not a part of the original. This is a quite interesting depiction of the characteristics of the whale figure. And in fact, upon my recollection just this morning when I was thinking about it, it gave further in my mind to why this is a Shungu representation in pole. This is a slash up here on the top that is typically, according to my artistic consultants, associated with a killer whale. But there was a carved piece that just sat on the ground that was quite similar to this piece that was found in 1980s and on Prince of Wales west of Klawock, between Klawock and Tuxican, but right opposite the Shungu home village of Shunk. And so the representation, I've got to get those pictures again to get those fully consolidated. So Kooteeyaa in the eyes and lives of Barrymore and Price. For Barrymore, this is a part of his existence of extravagance display. Grotesque and ghoulish figures to his Western trained eye for art, representing spiritual powers unknown. He was quite a spiritualist. In later life, during his collapse, he went to India, taking on a Hinduistic study. His taking is an example of the arrogance of the age. No attempt that I've been able to uncover was ever made to contact relevant parties or acquire information. Price trained in art and was on the leading edge of encountering primitive art, as his words indicated. He appreciated the artistic qualities of Kooteeyaa, and with his wife acquired his admirable collection of indigenous American art. But he always viewed it through the lenses of art and had no sense of its origination and purpose, no apparent curiosity about cultural significance. Neither owner made any effort to understand its cultural origins or the role in the culture of the creators, let alone its possible actual spiritual qualities. The museum thought the piece was from British Columbia during the NAGPRA phase of reporting, even though it had been identified as Tlingit from Tuxican, as I demonstrated in their records of acquisition. What is the traditional treatment of a faltering Kooteeyaa? Well, Dennis Demert, colleague and friend of mine for many years at the Tlingit clan, conducted a project in the 1960s to collect poles from the ancient southern Tlingit villages where they were falling into disrepair. Some elders at that time objected, saying they should be left to return to nature, not saved. Dennis, however, did much of the collecting in there at the Takjik'aan Heritage Center now. Shirley Kendall, who attended my presentation in Anchorage last spring, said that as a child she observed failing poles ceremoniously taken down, treated as beings and moved to the forest and carefully laid to rest through an act of ceremonious treatment. And James Williams, Kiksadi from Sitka, said that a clan could decide to create a replica pole, and the carver commissioned for such a task had a degree of artistic freedom in his carving of the replica. So Kooteeya's future. A number of possibilities are being examined, from return and display to recarving and erection in the Klawock Totem Park. Tlingit people of Klawock want Kooteeyaa to return. The Klawock Cooperative Association inquired of the Honolulu Museum of Art last May, following my reporting of this finding, what steps were needed for the repatriation of Kooteeyaa. The museum director approached his board of directors about repatriation to the Klawock Cooperative this past August. They voted to repatriate, and the Federal Register statement of repatriation is in preparation by museum staff. The Klawock tribe is eagerly planning for the return of Kooteeyaa and eventual display in a cultural heritage center. John Rowan, who himself is adopted Shunkwedi, hopes to carve a replica to place in the Klawock Totem Park. And so the end of the Travails of Kooteeyaa are not yet in place, but we're hoping for a positive outcome in the future. So thank you very much for your attention. I presume, as is customary, questions are in order? No.
Do you know who cut it up? Was it Barrymore when he got it and took it on the boat, or was it when they went to Hawaii? Or
The pole's 29 feet long, and the boat was 120 feet. I think he could have strapped it on without cutting it. So, but it's not clear. We don't know when it was divided into 3 poles, but it was shipped by Mary Price in 3 pieces to Honolulu at that point in time. Yeah.
Dr. Langdon, thank you so much for sharing this with us. I was curious, have you considered the sea creature possibly being a dog salmon?
No, it's not a dog salmon. Looks nothing like a dog salmon in terms of representations. It's a mammal, and it's not a shark. Yeah. Anybody? Yeah, Chuck?
Is there any indication that the very top figure and the very top of its head,
Yeah.
is that intact, or could it have had ears that had eroded away?
There are probably ears. If you, I have some other pictures that show that actually, if you see in the older picture, it actually was getting that classic grassy top on it already, and that may have been in between. But I think they're just sharply pointed ears in the top crest.
The Haidas, when they carved figures like that, they would put ears on them, but Tlingits did not.
No, they're not identifiable ears, and all of them, with the possible exception of the bottom figure, they clearly, it's Tlingit artwork, also because of the separation of the figures is an important defining. So, but there's one gentleman who thought that the use in the ears of the bottom figure is the one that's ambiguous. They're ambiguous to a certain extent, but the way in which the carving is done inside the ears is often an indication of one of the other styles. Yeah. Well, maybe you'll all be hearing about the return of Kooteeyaa in the future. Certainly hope so.
do you have any kind of time frame on it?
Well, we don't know what, they've got to write up this statement of repatriation that has to go in the Federal Register, and then that has to sit there for 30 or 60 days. People can make claims in that time period, and following that, then the museum has indicated that they will be prepared to ship it at their cost back to the tribe. So it's in process. It's certainly in process. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Steve.